I'm so delighted to bring everybody here today. My name is Helen Flynn and I work at Just Fair. We are an organisation who works towards the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights and the effective realisation of that across the UK. And if you're wondering what that means, and that all sounds a bit unclear to you, that's fine, because we're going to find out about all of that today. I'm the head of policy research and campaigns at Just Fair, and I'm just going to be chairing the event today, so you won't be hearing too much from me, don't worry. Just to begin with, for all our sessions, we always like to run through some ground rules, just so that we all know where we stand and we all understand the rules, because we're really into trying to create a human rights-based approach. And part of that is making sure that everybody's dignity is protected. So just run through those very quickly. And I think you got these in the email as well, so they shouldn't be a surprise. Safety and well-being take priority. This means if you need to leave the session, if you need anything from us, let me know. The chat is enabled so that Laura Grace from Just Fair and I will get your messages. So let us know, but if you need to leave, remember your safety and well-being take priority. We respect and we value difference. Part of the reason we're having these sessions is to hear what people are saying and to hear about their different viewpoints. So we really welcome people who've maybe not been part of the conversation coming in. All opinions count, and knowledge and expertise comes in many forms. So whether your knowledge comes through things that you've experienced in your life or things you've read about in books, it has great value, and we're so glad to have you today. This is a safe space for learning. We are all on our human rights journeys. We're all learning to do better, and we're all learning to do it in a way that better values people's rights. So don't worry about not getting everything right. Respect is, I think, the key thing here. At Just Fair, we commit to actively listening and improving, and part of that is going to be that you will be sent a link for a survey after this, because we really want to know how we can always do better. And so that's really important for us, if you could take a few minutes. Also, be respectful. Assume that people are talking with good intent. Try not to interrupt, although that can be really difficult in the digital space. I do recognise that. And respond to what's in front of you, not what you imagine someone might be saying or thinking. And then finally, share the air. This is always a little bit more difficult when we're doing these presentations followed by discussion sessions, but let's all try to make sure that everybody who wants to have time in the conversation can have time, and be conscious of who has and hasn't contributed. So that's it for my ground rules. I am just going to remind everybody, now we've got more people filtered in, that we are recording today. And hopefully you got a note about that in the email before you joined the event with the joining instructions. I'm also going to send the feedback form, and I'm going to encourage you all to join the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Network for the UK at the end of this, just to give you a pre-warning. But I don't want to talk too much more because I want to hand over to our speakers. So first up, we have my colleague, Laura Grace. And Laura is the Human Rights Officer here at Just Fair. And she brings experience of supporting community-led social justice efforts to know and claim their rights, particularly on issues relating to the environment, inequity, and housing in both the UK and Latin America. And Laura is going to give us an introduction to economic, social, and cultural rights today. So thank you, Laura. Pass to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Helen. Sorry, having some Zoom problems. It's been a while. Here we go. So hopefully this will share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Great, thank you so much. Yes, so as Helen says, my name is Laura. I'm the Human Rights Officer at Just Fair. And today I'm going to give us a really quick run through of our everyday rights and why talking about them matters, why that's something that we are really excited about at Just Fair. So just to overview, human rights are the basic freedoms and rights that belong to every single person in the world. They apply regardless of where you're from, what you believe in, or how you choose to live your life, and they're based on shared values like dignity, fairness, equality, respect, and independence. Modern human rights can be traced back to the Second World War, and after the Second World War, the international community came together to agree on a set of rights and freedoms that would apply, and this would be called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In adopting the declaration, the UN General Assembly recognised that human rights were the foundation of a more free and peaceful future, one where we're free not just from slavery and torture and discrimination, but one where we're free to access justice and seek asylum, to peacefully assemble and express ourselves, to gain an education and to work and to live a decent life with food on the table and a roof over our heads. These rights now form the foundation of laws and programs and practices that protect our rights in the UK and abroad, from international conventions drafted by the UN to the UK's Human Rights Act to local rights respecting programs. And this is important to know because when you ask someone about human rights, they don't usually think of things like putting food on the table, having a safe roof over their heads, or receiving a decent amount of money from the Home Office if that's something that you need. But these rights are equally as important as those we may think of more readily, like the right to vote or freedom from torture, and they have always been as important. It's these everyday rights that allow us to live day to day in security, peace, and dignity as the Declaration intended. And these are our economic, social, and cultural rights. So we've outlined here 6 of the everyday rights in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You'll see them in plain English. You'll see things like the right to work and to choose where to work, the right to adequate food, housing, and clothing, and the right to education. And we really like outlining them like this because when we talk about rights, some people immediately switch off. Especially economic, social, and cultural rights, when described like that in the abstract, can be really difficult to understand and identify with, especially if you're at the sharp end of rights violations. But we're entitled, all of us, to everything on this slide and more. Unfortunately, in the UK, many of us don't get to enjoy the 6 things outlined here and the more that are in the International Covenant. At Just Fair, we talk about everyday rights, about economic, social, and cultural rights, because when the UK fails to keep to its obligations, people suffer. The UK was instrumental in developing these human rights frameworks and this covenant, but it's failing to keep to its responsibilities to protect, respect, protect, and fulfill our economic, social, and cultural rights. And it's up to all of us to hold them to account for that. As a few examples, in the UK, 1 in 4 children is growing up in poverty in the UK. And if we focus in on Wales, that number rises to 34%, so 1/3 of children in every classroom in Wales. 6 out of 10 people with learning disabilities die before the age of 65, and Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller children have the lowest educational attainment at all stages of compulsory education. And then at the peak of the pandemic, the unemployment level of Black young people was 41.6%. which is 3 times that of unemployed white young people. These are everyday rights issues, all of them. And the causes of this pain can feel and often are baked into our current systems. So without a roadmap like economic, social, and cultural rights, it can feel impossible for us to build a better world. At Just Fair, we talk about everyday rights because we believe everyday rights are the key to making things better. So how do we do it? To achieve meaningful action and to make our rights a reality, everyday rights need to become the concerns of every single person across the UK, everybody on this call, everybody who you know, every single person. Because when we talk about rights, we encourage others to learn more and then they can speak out. When we talk about everyday rights, we prioritize those in need and we're making sure that those who need rights the most are the ones who are heard most loudly. And we also make sure that those with responsibilities under law are aware of that responsibility and aware of how their responsibilities impact on others and what they could do to make life easier for our wider community. And crucially, we call for accountability and for justice. And we like this quote at the bottom from one of our community researchers, because rights aren't just a nice idea and they're not just things that are for hoity-toity lawyers. They're tools. And when we own our rights, we can use them to make change and then we become powerful. So this has just been a really quick rundown on everyday rights. Just to hand back to Helen, but before I do so, it's really important, I think, that we keep in mind what we're striving for and the world that we're trying to build, where everyone can enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights. To us, this means a government that treats us with respect. So, for instance, one where all religions and benefits and beliefs are accommodated. It means a country where we are protected from human rights abuses and from others interfering with our rights. So that could be laws that protect us from discrimination, or standards for our homes that mean that we all live comfortably. And it's one where all of us know our rights and how to access them. And we have access to the schools, hospitals, and social security that meets the needs of our communities. So thanks so much. I'll pass back to Helen and our wonderful speakers.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. That was absolutely wonderful. And a really good introduction to what these rights are. We're now going to jump in a little bit what these rights look like in different parts of the UK. And first off, we're going to go up to Scotland and look at some of the really exciting developments up there. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our second speaker today, who is Kavita Chetty. Kavita is the Deputy Director for Human Rights at the Scottish Government. She's also a visiting Professor of Human Rights Law and Practice at Strathclyde University. And prior to working as a civil servant, Kavita worked for the Scottish Human Rights Commission for 13 years. So over to you, Kavita, and I'm going to share slides on your behalf.
Thanks very much, Helen. Thanks, Just Fair, for inviting me today. So I'm going to speak about the Human Rights Bill that we're developing and plan to introduce in the Scottish Parliament later this year. So it's a really significant piece of legislation for Scotland. And what we're seeking to do is to take some of those international human rights, particularly the economic, social, and cultural rights that Laura just spoke about, as well as 3 other UN treaties, and the right to a healthy environment, and we want to put them into Scots law through incorporation. And I thought it might be valuable within your context to understand a bit about where and why these proposals have emerged and what stage in the process we're at, which has really been the result of substantial input from across civil society in Scotland, and particularly the Scottish Human Rights Commission, or NHRI in Scotland as well. So I think it's fair to say over the course of the last 15, 20 years in Scotland, we've begun to collectively understand human rights and human rights-based approaches in a much broader sense. And I think really the austerity agenda in the early 2000s in Scotland really gave rise to this, where it was much more understood how human rights have that socio-economic dimension, which goes beyond the protections of the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. So rights like the rights Laura talked about, the rights to social security, to housing, began to take on a whole new significance and were drawn out more explicitly in work in Scotland. And then over time, we've seen that broader range of rights play out in social policy. So for example, in Scotland, in relation to land reform, social security, when further aspects of social security were devolved to Scotland, and in addressing food insecurity, we've seen the language of rights and rights protections being built into social policy and to some extent to legislation. And then going further in time, the experiences of Brexit, the experiences of COVID-19, I think really showed some of the vulnerabilities of the existing rights and equalities protections that we have, and also how in times of crisis, it's often women, people experiencing racism, disabled people, people from the lowest socioeconomic groups who face the biggest structural barriers to their rights and are most likely to be the most heavily impacted. And then over that same period, we had a UK government taking a position of real challenge towards the Human Rights Act, which has been strongly opposed in Scotland, both by government, by Parliament, and by civil society. So in opposing those changes to the Human Rights Act that were being touted, there was a strong sense in Scotland that human rights are really embedded within the devolution settlement in Scotland, and that duties on public bodies had allowed a human rights culture to develop that was really built into the fabric of devolution and how we like to do things in Scotland. So in short, I think all of these factors have converged to mean that the natural next step for Scotland has been to think about broadening and strengthening its human rights framework, and also aligning itself to broader support for the international rule of law. And so we really wanted to take these economic, social and cultural rights and give them more standing in Scotland. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. So it was against this backdrop, really, that a new far-reaching human rights bill for Scotland and the proposals have been developed over a number of years. So going back to 2018, there was a First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership, and they proposed this new Act of the Scottish Parliament for this broader range of rights. Then following this, and during COVID times, we had a national task force, which was co-chaired by a cabinet minister, and that further established that we would like the legislation to widen out to cover an even broader range of international treaty obligations, namely the treaties that cover the rights of women, disabled people, people experiencing racism. And those task force recommendations also were really aimed at strengthening not just the legal framework, but the broader implementation and accountability and access to justice for rights. So these recommendations, I have to say, we have to see them as really multi-institutional in nature. So by that, I mean the impact on not just the roles and responsibilities of courts, but also of Parliament, of scrutiny bodies and regulators, of national human rights institutions, as well as public bodies and those performing public services more broadly, including private actors. So a really far-reaching set of recommendations and proposals there. So in the intervening years, since the task force, I think the Scottish Government's remained really actively engaged with stakeholders to look at this, working through a whole range of advisory bodies and lived experience groups, crucially, as well, who have substantially inputted into the proposals. We've also had really significantly in Scotland, and this slide needs updated because we now have the UNCRC, that's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Incorporation Scotland Now Act, which took the rights of children from the UN and incorporated them into Scots law as well. So the bill proposals that we're developing build on all of these foundations and these ministerial commitments and these recommendations that have developed over time. They're undoubtedly really ambitious. So if they're agreed by the Scottish Parliament, we hope they'll really demonstrate some global leadership in this space, putting Scotland at the forefront of human rights legislation, but most importantly also of practice. Next slide, thanks Helen. So in terms of what we're trying to achieve, fundamentally what we want to do, as I say, is give domestic legal effect to these internationally recognised rights by putting them into Scots law within the limits of devolved competence, and that comes with a whole many layers of complexity, which I won't go into today. It's also intended that it will create duties on those delivering public functions to deliver the rights and improve access to justice where those rights are not upheld. And all of this is in line with Scottish Ministers' overarching commitment to embed equality, inclusion and human rights into everything that we do. So ultimately, this is about advancing Scotland's human rights culture. It's about putting human rights at the centre of law, policy and practice, and driving forward a targeting of policy measures and resources to tackle poverty, reduce inequality and then uphold human dignity in line with the national outcomes that Scottish ministers have agreed. So I'll give some very high level overview of some of the key bill proposals. They're pretty complex, so I won't go into too much detail here, but happy to take questions afterwards. Next slide, please, Helen, thanks. So, as I say, the bill proposes to incorporate 4 UN treaties into our law within devolved competence and include the right to a healthy environment. So we'll create duties for government and others delivering public services to embed rights in their decision making. There's a whole suite of proposals around improving access to justice, both judicial and non-judicial, increased powers for our National Human Rights Institution, building in better human rights-based scrutiny in Parliament to make sure that all legislation going through the Scottish Parliament is compatible with these rights, placing duties on regulators and scrutiny bodies to look at these rights, and then reporting duties for public bodies and indeed for Scottish ministers to report on both the plans that they have, forward-looking plans, and what they've achieved in relation to implementation of all of these rights in the bill. Next slide, please, Helen, thanks. So to give you a flavour of the rights that we're talking about here, and Laura covered some of them earlier, we're talking about the rights in the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So that's things like the right to work, social security, family life, adequate standard of living, which includes the right to food, housing, water and sanitation, right to health, right to education, right to culture. And then there are 3 group right treaties, which we're also embedding within the framework, namely the treaties in relation to women, disabled people and people experiencing racism that you see on the slide. And we're having to do this in a way where all of these treaties can interact with one another. And then finally, ministers have committed to including the right to a healthy environment, which of course is not contained within a UN treaty, but is recognised at UN level and is contained in around 150 constitutions around the world globally, and is really important in terms of the interdependence of all of these rights that we have in the framework. So overall here, our aim is to create a really strong framework where all of these rights can be read and applied consistently together and in line with international law. Next slide, please, Helen. So I think I'll skip over some of this complexity, but some of the key points in terms of how we're going to do this. We're going to do this in both a staggered and a layered way. So in line with the task force recommendations, we'll have a staggered approach to the commencement of duties. So we'll give duty bearers, all the public bodies, Scottish ministers, Scottish Government, time to prepare and develop a better understanding in terms of how they'll implement these rights. So initially, there'll be a procedural duty to build these rights into decision making, as well as all of the equalities and protections across the whole framework. Then after a preparation period of a few years, it's envisaged that this procedural duty falls away and is replaced with a stronger compliance duty for the economic, social rights and the right to a healthy environment. We'll also include an equality provision, which will protect all of those in line with the reservation on equal opportunities in Scotland, but will include older people and LGBTIQ people. And we'll include an interpretive provision which will allow the courts to read and apply all of these rights in line with both international law and that fundamental principle of human dignity. Next slide, please, Helen, thanks. So, oops, sorry, I thought we had another one, but I'll skip over this. Just very briefly to understand what compliance means when you talk about economic, social and cultural rights. I think that's really important to understand. In the context of our bill and drawing on international law understanding, that's about progressively realising the rights over time, which is a concept that comes from international law when it comes to looking at these rights. So that means 3 things for us. It means that policymakers have to show they're taking concrete, targeted and deliberate steps towards realising the right. It means they need to gather and deploy maximum available resources for effective realisation of the right. And then thirdly, it means non-retrogression. So there are specific tests to apply if there's rollback in the provision of the right, for example, in times of emergency. And additionally, in Scotland, we're looking at putting in place minimum core obligations. So these are the really basic elements of the right that are needed to secure a life of human dignity. And international guidance gives us a really good starting point for what a minimum core might be. But in Scotland, we want to develop this through a participatory process over time. So all in all, our ambition for this legislation, that it puts these economic, social and cultural rights into law, is that it will also address some of those structural barriers for those with the most barriers to realising their rights in practice. And we hope that this legislation can serve as a model to be learnt from across the UK as we navigate this terrain in terms of better implementation and better enforcement and accountability for economic, social and cultural rights. But we do recognise that this is very much a staging post, and there's going to be significant and sufficient work to do to sufficiently support the implementation of this ambition. And we'll look to build a programme of capacity building, of guidance, and of awareness raising going forward to ensure that we realise that ambition. So that's my time well and truly over, but I hope that you've got a sense there of where we're going in Scotland and the importance that we're giving to these rights in practice in Scottish Government. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Kavita. And I was saying just maybe before everybody joined that we're planning to have a space on our website for each of these sessions that has the recording, that has a summary of each of the discussions, and also any documents. So anything you want to send us through, Kavita, about what you've just talked about, we would really welcome those. So I am going to introduce then our next speaker. So from Wales, from Scotland, we're going to shoot down to Wales now. And Rhian Davies is the Chief Executive of Disability Wales and also a long-time campaigner on disability rights issues. Rhian is a member of the Welsh Government Human Rights Advisory Group and also the Disability Rights Task Force. So Rhian, over to you.
Diolch Helen, Prynhawn da pawb, good afternoon everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and have this sort of rights-based discussion and hear what's happening around the UK. Also good to see some colleagues from Wales on the call and to hear about, you know, the tremendous work that's going on in Scotland around progressing human rights. So I'm from Disability Wales. We're the National Association of Disabled People's Organisations striving for the rights and equality of all disabled people, and our core role is to represent the views and priorities of our members to government with the aim of informing and influencing policy. So that's primarily Welsh Government, but also UK Government on well, wherever possible, on non-devolved issues. So I'm going to spend some time talking about how we endeavour to make rights real from a disability rights perspective, but I will give a bit of background to where the progress of rights and implementation of rights is in Wales on a wide range of issues. So there is a very, and it has been, you know, throughout devolution, you know, strong commitment in Wales to approaches based on human rights and equality, and the Human Rights Act is embedded in the Government of Wales Act, and then it's being followed through in sort of different bits of legislation around social care and additional learning needs, for example. Also, Welsh Government enacted the socio-economic duty in the Equality Act, and also has Wales-specific equality duties, which have, you know, often been regarded as, you know, perhaps amongst the more robust equality-specific duties across the UK. As a result of lobbying from human rights stakeholder organisations in Wales, the Welsh Government commissioned a very significant piece of research into strengthening and advancing equality and human rights in Wales, which has been led by Professor Simon Hoffman from Swansea University, who many of you will, I'm sure, know. So a significant piece of research made 40 recommendations, and it concluded that the Welsh Government should bring forward primary legislation to incorporate UN human rights conventions in Welsh law, so that incorporated rights are enforceable in a court or tribunal. So very much, you know, and we've very much taken the Scottish model, you know, as an approach there as an important template for us. So Welsh Government accepted those recommendations, and as a result of campaigning from Disability Wales and other disability organisations, and also the Women's Equality Network Wales, also agreed to incorporate both CEDAW and the UN CRDP. So the Welsh Government has set up a human rights advisory group, which is kind of overseeing how the recommendations in the strengthening rights and equality report should be taken forward, and also a legislative options working group chaired by Charles Whitmore, who I can see is on the call, which is looking more specifically at how those rights could be enacted, I suppose, within the remit of devolved powers in Wales. So at this stage, we're still kind of doing the analysis, particularly focusing on the CEDAW and UNCRDP conventions. We're not as far ahead as Scotland, but we are hoping that within this Senedd term, there will be a green paper produced to consult upon and hopefully inform progress in the next Senedd term. Other areas where sort of rights-based approaches have been taken forward around the right to housing, for example. Housing organisations in Wales have campaigned for the right to adequate housing, and there's been a cooperation agreement made between the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, which has committed Welsh Government to publishing a white paper on proposals for introducing a right to adequate housing in Wales. And also, over the last couple of years, the Welsh Government has published an anti-racist action plan, a rights-based approach to achieving a vision of a Wales that is anti-racist, and an LGBTQ+ action plan, which includes strengthening the equality and human rights of LGBTQ+ people. In terms of disability, as a result of a co-produced report called Locked Out, which is about the impact of COVID on disabled people, the First Minister of Wales agreed to set up a disability rights task force to look at the recommendations and to take forward a rights-based approach and the development of a new disability rights action plan that would recommit Welsh Government to an approach to policy based on the social model of disability and also the principles of the UNCRDP. So that the Disability Rights Task Force has been meeting since 2021. It's set up a number of, I think it's about 9 working groups, taking a thematic approach to different issues such as travel, children and young people, social care and independent living. And the aim is to produce a draft disability rights action plan, which will hopefully be issued for consultation this year. So that's kind of a bit of an overview. In terms of within Disability Wales, how we've endeavoured to take a rights-based approach using particularly the UNCRDP. We've used that very much as a campaigning tool, as an accountability tool, and also an empowerment tool. So in terms of campaigning, going back to 2011, we published a manifesto for independent living based on Article 19 on the right to independent living, and successfully lobbied Welsh Government to introduce a framework for action on independent living, a cross-cutting approach to tackling a range of barriers disabled people face to independent living, underpinned by the social model and the UNCRDP. In terms of, and then we kind of doubled down on that then in our 2021 campaign, Bring Us Our Rights, which called for full incorporation of the UNCRDP, particularly in recognition of the implementation gap between national frameworks and delivery on the ground. And in response to the survey of our members that indicated that 76% of our members didn't have any confidence really that their rights would be fulfilled within the next 5 years. In terms of using the UNCRDP to around accountability, that was particularly important during COVID. Many examples, but one specific example was around what appeared to be what evidence of concerns around disabled people being denied access to treatment, and the issuing of do not attempt resuscitation notices without any, on a blanket basis, without any consultation with the individual or family members. So Disability Wales and other colleagues published a statement. We had over 1,400 signatories to that, about, you know, the right of access to treatment, and that this blanket approach shouldn't be taken. And a response to that, the Chief Medical Officer did issue a statement to health bodies to say that, you know, such an approach would be totally unacceptable. In terms of empowerment, we've produced resources such as I Know Your Rights pack, which sets out disabled people's rights under the UNCRDP and equality legislation and Welsh laws. And that gives practical examples and case studies of how disabled people as individuals and then collectively as groups and, you know, DPOs can use their rights, either, for example, to challenge decisions around social care and, you know, their packages of support, or perhaps collectively to campaign, you know, for example, on local authority policy that, for example, has reduced the number of blue badge parking in an area. We've also produced resources to be used in the national curriculum of Wales and by teachers and practitioners and around the UNCRDP. And when we piloted it, it went down really well with teachers and pupils alike. And for example, one year 6 class then went on to do an access survey of their local high street and were so appalled by you know, how bad the access was. They then petitioned the Senedd to, you know, have stronger enforcement of, you know, of access issues for disabled people. So that's really good in terms of future leadership and campaigning into the future. So I think we've still got a long way to go in Wales. The commitment is there, but the delivery is still needed. But, you know, the importance for us of incorporation of the UNCRDP, you know, is to ensure that rights are embedded in policy and delivery from the outset, that policy makers and practitioners have clear expectations of their duties and in terms of delivery and rights, and most importantly, that disabled people's rights holders know what their rights are, how to exercise them, and also, you know, what they can expect, you know, from the public bodies that they interact with. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rhian. And I think from our first 3 speakers, we've really seen the ways in which people's rights are being violated. We have seen that there's really concentrated efforts to make change across the UK, and there's lots of really exciting stuff happening. And I think my question for our last speaker, Kate, is how can we get involved in that and what can we do? So I'm delighted to welcome our last speaker, Kate Ewing, who is a researcher at Just Fair. And alongside her work at Just Fair, Kate is working towards or on a PhD at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. And the focus of her work is work time and the minimum wage. Kate previously worked in London as a labour rights solicitor, representing trade unions and their members. So passing over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Helen, and hello to everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to join the call today and to follow on from 3 fantastic presentations. And maybe start thinking a bit about, or talk a bit about how we've been started thinking at Just Fair, how we can join up some of the ideas that we've heard about to sort of form a UK-wide vision to better protect economic, social and cultural rights in the whole of the UK. And so, you know, as we heard from Laura's introduction, these everyday rights are so important to everybody, and they're rights which exist in international law, but they're not currently protected in laws across the whole of the UK. And it really doesn't have to be like that. As we've just heard, we know it's possible to at least begin to better protect our everyday rights, as we've heard from the really inspiring work underway in Scotland and Wales. And so, as I said, at Just Fair, we've been thinking about what measures and policies would need to be what measures and policies would be needed for incorporation of these rights across the whole of the UK to make the much needed changes that we need to see. This is, as Helen's mentioned, is the first in a series of discussions that we're organising throughout 2024, which we're calling the Route to a Better UK, the Everyday Rights Conversation, because a UK vision and a UK incorporation of these rights is very ambitious and will need careful thought and preparation to make it work for everyone. And so having as many people with diverse viewpoints and experiences participating will be really important. And what we have been working on and what we think might be helpful is to have some kind of structure to these discussions based on 5 principles that we've identified for thinking around the thinking that needs to be done, so that we can start to imagine and build the practical measures and policies that could guarantee our everyday rights for us all. And so I'm just going to share my screen so you can see a summary of the rights, the principles, sorry. So there we go. So this is a summary of our 5 principles, and I'm going to just talk through each of them in a little bit more detail to explain what we mean. So our first principle is rights knowledge, and rights knowledge and education are of core importance for protecting rights. People need to know that the rights exist in the first place and that they're their rights. Decision makers need to know how to address and guarantee the rights in the work that they do. And people responsible for administering rights, so civil servants, for example, need to understand the rights and the role that they play in their activities. In addition to the rights, and in addition to knowledge about the rights themselves, it's also important that the processes which relate to them are well understood. So, for example, if people experience a failure to protect or respect their rights, they need to know what they can do, where they can turn to for help and support, and how to seek changes. Our second principle is rights frameworks. Economic, social and cultural rights require frameworks to implement them into domestic law and incorporate them into day-to-day life across the UK. And there's many ways that this can be done, and countries adopt different approaches depending on their constitutional setup. And we've heard in both Kavita and Rhian's presentations about operating within the limits of the devolutionary settlements that they have. So there are lots of factors that have to be taken into account. But in addition to the law itself, we also need to see systems and structures which make that law work in practice. So I think that's what Rhian referred to as the delivery of the rights on the ground. And so this means thinking about duties to be placed on decision makers, what they are and what's required, legal standards and tests that should be applied, how proactive rights protection can be inbuilt so that people's rights are respected from the outset. There needs to be provision of routes to remedy which are accessible and not overly burdensome, so that barriers to justice are minimised. We need a system for ensuring access to advice and advocacy for all, and in a timely way. And there needs to be inbuilt protection for people against victimisation if they do raise complaints, because there's no point having routes to remedy where people aren't protected from reprisals for complaining about rights violations. Our third principle is rights resourcing. And we really are thinking about resourcing in a very broad context, in a very broad sense. So first off, the rights themselves need to be substantively and proactively resourced. So that would mean there ought to be ongoing progressive review of rights so that improvements can be proactively made. So by that, I mean, it shouldn't have to be necessary to wait for things to go wrong or decision makers to fall short to seek improvement of people's day-to-day lives and rights protections. And then it's also the case that where protections and guarantees do fall short, it's very important that there are complaints and monitoring mechanisms that are properly resourced so that people can seek redress and changes. And this idea of resourcing requires us to, we think, to use a broad definition, which includes not only the financial and legal costs, but also recognises the emotional burden and costs for those who experience rights violations and raise complaints. And so this would involve, for example, ensuring broad and well-resourced support services beyond access to legal advice and support, which is of course important and a key element, so that people feel that they can challenge a failure to protect their rights. And that leads us to our fourth principle, which is rights accountability. So there needs to be accountability in any system of rights protection as a fundamental standard. And routes to remedy form, or the ability to complain, seek and receive, routes to remedy are an integral part of accountability mechanisms. So that's the ability to complain, seek and receive resolution of a situation. And it's important that these work well in practice and are actually effective. And so remedies ought to include both provision for reparation and also steps for changes. We would suggest that there ought to be participation by both those who experience rights violations in the remedy to their own complaints and also decision makers. And that's so there's scope for reflection and dialogue on what ought to be and what can be achieved in terms of real and sustainable change. An inherent part of any effective remedy and process of reparation and change is that lessons are learned. The goal must be systemic change and non-repetition of rights violations, in addition to addressing the specific experience complained about by individuals or groups. You don't want to have a system which is designed where people can keep complaining, but nothing fundamentally it changes, so that people are experiencing the same violations over and over again. And then our final principle is of rights enjoyment. So the protection and enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights will be a process of learning, evaluation, reflection and progressive change. And that will require ongoing assessment and revision of systems so that there is compliance with international frameworks on the maximum use of resources and rights obligations. And the participation of rights holders in an evaluation process will be fundamental to determining how rights are actually being experienced day to day across the UK. And it can also serve to further highlight when more work needs to be done in guaranteeing protections. And that really is the ultimate test of incorporation, is what people are experiencing on the ground. So these principles are hopefully a starting point for a really important discussion that we would like to encourage everybody to participate in. And we would hope that we can get people together to generate ideas and proposals about how we can practically achieve incorporation. We think, like I said at the beginning, the sharing of ideas and thoughts with as many people with as wide and diverse range of experiences as possible is going to be key. And so I will take the opportunity to encourage you all to attend our next discussion session, which will be on the 28th of February, where we will start talking about our first principle, or using that as our framework for the discussion, talking about rights knowledge and how we can build and embed that more deeply, and again in a very broad sense. And we would also, as Helen has highlighted at the beginning, she's going to be encouraging you to as well encourage everybody to join up to the UK Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Network, so that we can continue with this important work. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Kate, and a huge thank you to all our speakers. I've just drop the link to sign up to the next event in the chat, and I know Laura has just also dropped the ESCR network. Question time. So in our upcoming sessions, there's going to be a lot more space for the kind of discussion. This time it's a bit shorter on this one because this was more of an introduction, more of us talking. But anybody have questions, raise your hand, or if you'd prefer me to read your question out, drop it in a direct message to me and I'll read it out on your behalf. Charles, come on ahead.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks to everyone for really inspiring and absolutely excellent presentations. I had a small question for Kavita, if that's okay. I mean, I caught where you said that obviously you're going for a sunset provision where the procedural duties would fall away. I think you said in favour of the duty of compliance. Were there any discussions, and could you perhaps explain the thinking about whether there was any consideration of merit of having duty of compliance alongside procedural duties simultaneously?
Thank you so much for that, Charles. So that's whether not having the duty to pay due regard fall away, but actually have it come into force, and then the duty to comply also sit alongside it. And Nell, I'm going to take your question quickly as well.
Hello. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. It was a question for Kavita as well. Let me see. I have two. I think the first one I'm going to go for is a lot of these rights seem to talk about public institutions and infrastructure, like legal infrastructure and things like that. But I was wondering if that also applies to other public bodies like universities or I don't know, companies and other private institutions.
Wonderful, Nell. So who this duty is going to apply for. And I have one more question. I'm going to do three for you at once from Paul in the chat. And that's how long do people think the timescale this will take? Is it 50 years to 100 years? Or are you hoping for these human rights to be embraced in legislation in the next 10? So, Kavita, I think there was one question aimed specifically at you. Then after that, come on ahead, speakers.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for fantastic questions. So Charles, if I get the gist of your question, you're asking whether or not that procedural duty to build rights into decision making will fall away or will continue. Have I got the question right?
Yeah,
So
I think I got you said it fell away, but I wasn't sure whether that was actually the case or whether it would actually continue alongside compliance.
So it would probably give it.
Yeah, it's a complex model, so I don't know if I can fully do this justice in this setting, but I'll try. So when it comes to CRPD, CEDAW, and CERD, so the treaties protecting women, disabled people experiencing racism, there is an ongoing group protection duty to build that into decision making. And that has implications as well for the scope of our bill within devolution. That will apply to all devolved areas, regardless of whether they are derived from UK acts or Scottish acts. So that's quite important for us. But the preparation duty, which applies to all of the rights, economic, social and cultural rights, right to healthy environment, that will then become a compliance duty. But we think the way in which our compliance duty is built, which is about progressive realisation, already has embedded within that the idea that you have to build all of these rights in your decision making and show how you're doing that in relation to really quite strict tests, if you like, which are derived from international law around what progressive realisation means. So in short, yes, the procedural duty falls away in relation to ESCR rights, right to healthy environment, but in essence it continues because it's very much part of the ongoing compliance duty, but we're looking at that really carefully. In relation to the other question that we had around whether this is just about public bodies or it goes wider, currently in our proposals, we hope to go wider and cover all bodies that are performing public functions, which is the same approach that the UNCRC Scotland Act has taken. So where private actors are delivering public services, they'll be caught within the scope of the Act. And then the final question, I think, around timescales. So again, in relation to our legislation, we'll see what Scottish Parliament says, we do think it does need time. There will have to be a period between the initial commencement of that duty to build these rights into decision making and that stronger compliance duty to allow us to have a participatory process, to think what the minimum standards are, to develop guidance, to develop capacity building across all of the duty bearers. So that will take some time. And I think also in relation to the broader implementation landscape in terms of how public bodies really understand and embed these rights in decision making and budget setting processes, etc., how we really strengthen access to justice in the way that Kate outlined, both judicial and non-judicial, how we build it into advice services, advocacy, etc. I think these are all, much longer term endeavours. So in Scotland, we hope to have this on our statute book relatively soon, but we do recognise it's a staging process to improve access to rights overall.
Thank you so much for that, Kavita. And Rhian, I'm going to come over to see if you wanted to respond to any of those questions.
Yeah, well, I was reflecting on the one about the time scale, and it does feel like when it comes to rights, it's a glacial, glacial pace. So, I was introduced as a long-time campaigner on disability rights, and so I was around in the 90s when we were campaigning for fully enforceable and comprehensive civil rights legislation, which eventually gave rise to the Disability Discrimination Act, obviously now subsumed by the Equality Act. And I know at the time when we were campaigning, we thought we were campaigning for what would be a better, more inclusive future for the next generation of young disabled people. And all these years on, I always feel a bit sad when I talk to younger colleagues, and often facing very similar issues, and it does feel that we, over the last sort of 10-15 years, we have regressed. But I think I don't know, with on a human rights basis, I think that it is important to be optimistic, and to the universalism of human rights means that they are there for everybody, and that it can be realized. And when you take part in calls like this, it does give you that inspiration and that motivation to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhian. And we're running quickly out of time. So Kate, Laura, your reflections on those questions?
Just quickly on the time point, I think that both previous speakers make really important points, which is that there's the time that it's going to take to get the law, and that in domestic law, and then there's the time to get things going in practice, and it's important to be aware of that. And in many ways, I think with economic, social and cultural rights, it's almost like a job that can never truly be finished, because you're constantly seeking to improve things and take steps forward. So it's sort of in many ways the really important thing is for us to get going for a UK-wide approach on this, and draw on the inspiration that we see in Scotland and in Wales, and sort of join things together so that everyone is hopefully getting better protection. And then it's the beginning of a probably lifelong journey of constantly trying to improve things and making sure that people are experiencing their rights in practice on the ground.
Thank you so much, Kate. Laura?
No, I'd agree with all the speakers. I think now is definitely the time to put our backs behind this and really start pushing for it. I think when we look at the time we're in now, we keep being told that we're living in absolutely unprecedented times and we've been through COVID, and then the cost of living crisis. That means that the Social Justice Commission released a report at the end of last year saying that basically the gaps between the general public and the most disadvantaged in Britain at the moment is like back to like pre-Victorian levels of like complete divide. And I think when we look at times like these, we have to think about what has come from similarly unprecedented times. So things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the NHS and other things that really positive things can come in these times if we all band together, hopefully like we are seeing in Scotland and in Wales. Sorry, that's not as a well answered question as the
I
other
thought that
speakers.
was quite a cheery end, though, that they're good can come of this. So I want to say a massive thank you to our speakers, a massive thank you to all of us to all of you folks for being here today. Just to let you know, I'm going to be sending out the survey, the link to the next event, and sign-ups for our newsletter and this ESCR network in an email to everyone tomorrow. Then, as I said, we're going to start doing a web page with resources with a write-up of this and things around resources. So I'll send you an email in a couple of weeks when that's ready, and that's going to be me done emailing you unless you sign up to hear more. Finally, just to let you know as a reminder, this conversation is going to be ongoing throughout 2024, and then we hope to come up with a set of proposals or a paper towards the end of 2024 once we've finished listening to what everybody's telling us. So thank you so much to everybody. We're so delighted to have you all join us today. Goodbye, folks.